So, the first area James discusses is the psychological. And he says many ideals of ours, many ethical ideals, arose in connection with pleasure and pain. So, you might consider a bad toothache, or brutal architecture, or a happy occasion. Right? So, these terms all reflect sort of the pain or pleasure we get from experiencing in these different circumstances. But James is cautioning us. He says, and look, that's good as far as it goes. Utility and pleasure and pain is not a fully sufficient answer for our ethical experience. There are combinations, there are relations of experience, there are other impulses and experiences that we have in different environments. These all play a role as well. There is an ineliminable sense, too, we have of a right, something being right or being fit or maybe being noble, if you'll permit that word. Our tastes, in a way, are part of our psychology, and these tastes of what sort of feels right or what we intuit is right is part of the judgment of whether or not something is right. So we seem to have ideals that are of a seemingly higher kind, that are not justified just on a calculation of hedons, right, of pleasure and pain. And James argues this is not enough to make James into, a Kantian intuitionist, but he does think that these ideals should be all understood together as being part of what we bring to moral reality. We do not find any of these answers as being absolutely sufficient or satisfactory, but we do understand that whatever ideals we come up with are not just being measured against a sort of pre-existing moral reality or a moral heaven, but as perspective, right? Something that's looking towards the future as a way to shape the future. So an ideal for James, and you'll see this in James's other piece, What Makes a Life Significant, ideals are proleptic, they are prospective, they are ways of thinking about the future, they are tools. The second area James considers for our moral life is the metaphysical. This is, again, where we're trying to understand key ethical terms, such as good or ill or obligation. And he says, let's try a thought experiment, right? Imagine that there is a world with no one on it, right? Or imagine, he says, a purely physical material universe. Right? There's no good or bad in a strictly material or physical universe, right? I mean, think about it. Before any sentient beings come along, two asteroids collide and they're both destroyed, right? Did something wrong happen? Well, I mean, clearly not, right? Change happened, but not wrong. So ethical terms require sentient minds for morality to have any meaning, he says. So good is what is felt good by a sentient being. And a world that has two people or even more people introduce more complexity, more schemes of what feels or what is good. So the philosopher sees this increasingly complicated pluralistic world and wants to rise above all of these individuals, all of these cases and complicated relations happening where people are butting heads and demanding the same thing at the same time. Or even when an individual says, I want this, but I also want this, right? I want the cupcake, I want good health, right? So James understands that the philosophical impulse is to rise above this and to find the scheme of what ought to be for all, right? For all time, right? To find the scheme. But he says, if that philosopher remembers that there's no natural moral state, right? Remember just the asteroids, there's no moral reality there. If the philosopher remembers that there's no pre-existing moral situation or state to compare the competing schemes with, then they will understand that there's no abstract moral order with an objective truth that would validate whatever it is that we prescribe once we're here. Obligations that we have require actual claims by particular people. Claims are based on desires. Large desires make bigger claims and create bigger obligations. And that doesn't mean that all obligations must be satisfied, but if they're claimed, an obligation is created, and then the question becomes, how do these obligations sort of butt up and measure up against other desire claim obligations? Okay? I hope that's clear. We can talk about that. The third area of moral inquiry that James considers is the casuistic. These are the cases that make up our ethical data. The world is filled with conflicting ideals. And there's at least a split opinion among people as to whether or not there's a God that has an ideal ordering plan for all of these conflicts. And of course, there are multiple interpretations of God and even more interpretations of what God's will is and how God's law would apply or would not apply and so forth. So we're off to the races even if there is agreement on a divine or supernatural order. The philosophical difficulty is, how does one recognize as a philosopher that there's no pre-existing given moral order, that one is not going to take the path of skepticism, and that one also recognizes that whatever one comes up with, whatever philosophical system I come up with as an ethicist, I am not going to try to elevate my own view as the ideal, right? I'm going to try to be impartial. This is in a way just asking, how does one approach the philosophical task of understanding the data of ethical experience? Maybe, James says, we can find a common essence, right, in the goods that already exist. Well, what kind of essence? What kind of essence should we look for in the various things we find good? Utility, usefulness, efficiency, natural law, the categorical imperative, the golden mean, right? The form of the good. I mean, there are lots of suggestions from lots of different philosophers. But James notes that there's no clear favorite, right? There's no sort of single victor among the different philosophical ethical systems that exist. So he says maybe the capacity to bring happiness is what's common. Maybe that's the best proposal for what's a common essence among our existing moral experience, right? This is a kind of happiness that we're not specifying what the happiness has to look like in advance. It's just whatever the ability to bring happiness is the essence. So in other words, he says, let's think of this maybe even in slightly more careful terms as the ability to satisfy demand. This is a better framing for this common essence of good. Any kind of demand. Well, if we accept that, where does it lead? Well, we recognize that the ideal and what's actual is always in tension. There's always a pinch, he says, between the actual situation and the ideal situation. How should we rank demands, right? Assuming that things are in competition, there's a pinch between the actual and the ideal. How do we rank what's best? How do we rank demands? How do we adjudicate between claims? This is the philosopher's question, and it's very hard to determine. So James says, well, we have to recognize that when we come onto the scene, there are already many demands that are societally ordered, right? They're conventional. You might say they're ideological. We also recognize that objectivity demands that we don't just give in to convention, right? Full stop. We don't just say, well, the way we do things is, right, heterosexual, property-oriented, efficiency, technology accepting, whatever, English speaking. We don't just automatically accept convention, but we recognize that there's a lot that is conventional. How do we prescribe ideals without there being a God, without there being a schoolmaster or a dictator, right? These are all goals. James says we need to find a way to recommend ideals in a way that is not pointing at a divine order, which is not wagging a finger like a schoolmaster, or is not coercing people like what Peirce would have called the method of authority. Right? So James says the challenge for the philosopher is to not give in to dogmatism and to not give in to skepticism. Right? So he says, well, all right. He puts all that together and he thinks, all right, well, maybe it should be satisfy as many demands as we can. Right? That's the principle, to satisfy as many demands as possible. Right? The best act is the one which creates the best whole, right? Or at least the least the least amount of dissatisfactions. So this is James's idea, right? That we should be as inclusive of others' goods as possible as we are forming our own goods. And inclusivity, he says, if you look over time, has led to a wider and wider range of demands satisfied. A sort of expanding circle of demands have been increasingly satisfied. Now, all this thing seems pretty reasonable. Is it justified? Right? How does James justify this supreme principle? Right? Which we might again sort of recapitulate: act so as to satisfy as many demands as possible. Would this be chosen behind a veil of ignorance? Right? How would we get to this? Is this principle the result of some kind of reflective equilibrium, or is it just intuitive? It seems that if you think about what James has said so far, some kind of intuition is the only reasonable alternative for how he gets to this principle, right? Given the metaphysical premises that James has ruled out. But it's an intuition. If it is an intuition, probably the best word for it, if it is an intuition, it's coming from a felt, lived, empirical place. It's a generalization over lived experience. It's not deduced or sort of posited by rationalistic, logical, a priori reasoning.